I was 19 when this happened, and at the time I was taking pretty much any job I could get. I was in my first year of community college, still living at home, trying to save money, and babysitting had kind of become my fallback whenever I needed cash fast. Most of the jobs were completely normal. Put the kid to bed, watch TV for a few hours, get paid, go home. Easy. This one only stood out because of how suddenly it came together. It was a Friday afternoon in October, rainy and already getting dark early. And I got a text from a number I didn't know. The woman introduced herself as Heather. She said she got my number from a neighborhood Facebook group where someone had recommended me. She needed a sitter for that night, 7 to midnight, maybe a little later, for her 8-year-old son, Owen. She said they'd had another sitter cancel last minute. That part wasn't strange by itself. What was strange was how quickly she pushed the job. Before I could even ask the normal questions, she sent another text saying they lived in a nice area, Owen was easy, and she'd pay me in cash. Then she said, "Please tell me you're available. We really can't cancel tonight." I remember staring at that message for a second because the wording felt intense. Not rude? Exactly. Just too urgent for a babysitting job? But I needed the money, and the pay she offered was better than usual. So I said yes. She sent me the address. It was about 20 minutes away, on the edge of a neighborhood I had only driven through a few times. Big older houses, lots of trees, long driveways. The kind of place that looked nice in daylight, but a little too quiet at night. She also sent one more text that I didn't notice until I was already getting ready to leave. It said, "Owen will probably already be asleep. If he wakes up, don't let him watch anything scary. And if anyone knocks, don't answer the door." We aren't expecting anyone. That gave me a weird feeling. But again, not weird enough to cancel. Parents say stuff like that. Don't answer the door. Don't order food. Don't let the kids stay up late. I figured maybe they had nosy neighbors or something. I got there around 6:50. It had stopped raining, but the whole street was slick and reflective, and there weren't any streetlights right near the house. Their place sat a little back from the road behind 2 huge trees, and the porch light was on, but the rest of the front of the house was mostly dark. It was bigger than I expected. Not mansion huge, but definitely bigger than average. Dark brick, tall front windows, and one of those old red front doors with heavy brass hardware. Heather answered almost immediately after I knocked. She looked like she'd been getting ready in a rush. Nice dress, makeup done, but still putting on an earring as she opened the door. Behind her, a man I assumed was her husband was standing near the staircase, tying a tie and checking his watch. The first thing I noticed was that neither of them smiled, not in a hostile way, more like they were distracted or stressed. Heather let me in and thanked me 3 times in under a minute. She kept talking fast, giving me basic instructions. Owen had eaten already. There were snacks in the pantry if he got hungry. Bedtime was usually 8:30, but he'd already fallen asleep upstairs after a long week at school. If he woke up crying, just sit with him for a while. He had bad dreams sometimes. She said all this while glancing past me at the windows every few seconds. Her husband finally walked over and introduced himself as Daniel. He shook my hand, but his grip was distracted too, like his mind was somewhere else entirely. He said, "Cell service can be bad in here, so connect to the Wi-Fi if you need us." Then, after a short pause, he added, "And just keep the doors locked." "Okay?" I laughed a little and said, "Of course." But he didn't laugh back. He just looked at me and said, "I mean it." That was the first moment where I really felt something shift. Because until then, it had just been a little awkward. People being in a hurry. Parents being overly cautious. But the way he said that was different. Not like a parent reminding a sitter to be responsible. More like someone trying to warn you without actually explaining what the warning was. Heather grabbed her purse and repeated the same thing from the text. If anyone knocks, don't answer, even if they say they know us. Just call me. I remember saying, okay, in this hesitant way, hoping one of them would explain why. But neither did. Daniel just handed me a slip of paper with both their numbers on it, plus the house address, and said they'd be back by midnight. Then they left. Just like that, I locked the door behind them and stood there for a few seconds in the entryway, listening to their car back out of the driveway. When the sound faded, the house went dead quiet. And I know every empty house gets quiet once the adults leave, but this one felt different. Heavy. Like the silence had weight to it. I decided the best thing to do was act normal. I checked the locks. Front door, back door, all good. Then I looked around the first floor. The house was clean, but in a very staged kind of way, like they'd pick things up fast before leaving. There were dishes drying by the sink, a little boy's backpack by the dining table, and a lamp on in the living room. Family photos were everywhere. Owen at a baseball game. Owen in a Halloween costume. The three of them at the beach. Totally normal. I even started to feel stupid for being nervous. I made some tea, sat on the couch, and put on one of those harmless home renovation shows at low volume. After 10 minutes, I was already calmer. Then I heard footsteps overhead. Not quick ones. Slow. Distinct. Like someone walking from one side of the second floor to the other. I muted the TV and listened. Another step, then another, and then nothing. My first thought was Owen. Maybe he was awake and moving around his room. So I went upstairs. The second floor landing overlooked the entryway, and from up there, the house somehow felt even darker. There was one night light in the hallway and a strip of warm light under a partially open door at the far end. I assumed that was Owen's room. As I got closer, I could hear the faint sound of a cartoon playing. When I knocked lightly and pushed the door open, Owen was sitting in bed, wide awake, watching something on a tablet. He looked up at me and didn't seem surprised at all. He just said, "You came." That's exactly how he said it. Not, "Hi." Not, "Are you the babysitter?" Just, "You came." I smiled and said, "Yeah. Your parents told me you might be asleep already." He shrugged. I don't like sleeping when they're gone. Kids say things like that. So I didn't think much of it. I asked if he needed anything, and he shook his head. Then, before I left, he asked me, "Did they tell you about the knocking?" I stopped in the doorway. "What do you mean?" He looked back at his tablet. "The man who knocks." I laughed, but it came out weak. "No, they just said not to answer the door." He nodded, like that confirmed something. Then he said, very casually, "Good. Don't." And then he turned the volume up. I went back downstairs telling myself this was probably some neighborhood weirdo, maybe a homeless guy, maybe an ex-neighbor with mental issues. Whatever. Kids absorb adult fear really fast. If his parents had been tense about it before, obviously he'd pick up on that and turn it into a whole spooky thing. Still, I checked the front windows. The driveway was empty. The road beyond it was dark. Nothing there. By 8:30, I'd mostly relaxed again. Owen stayed upstairs. I could hear his tablet sometimes, and once I heard the toilet flush. But that was it. The TV downstairs was back on. I was half scrolling on my phone, and I remember thinking that the awkward beginning would probably just make a funny story later. At exactly 9:02, Someone knocked on the front door. 3 knocks. Not loud, not frantic, just slow, deliberate knocks. I froze. For a second, I honestly thought maybe Heather or Daniel had come back because they forgot something. But if that were the case, wouldn't they just unlock the door? They each had keys. Then I remembered Heather's text. If anyone knocks, don't answer. The knocks came again. Same pattern. 3 slow taps. I stood up and walked quietly toward the entryway, keeping to the side so I wouldn't be visible through the small glass panels next to the door. My heart was pounding way harder than it should have been. I don't know why I was that scared already. It's not like the person had done anything yet, but something about the way those knocks sounded was just intentional. Patient. I peeked through the sidelight window. There was a man standing on the porch. I only saw him from the side at first. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket and jeans, maybe late 40s or early 50s. His hair looked damp, like he'd been outside a while. He wasn't doing anything strange. He was just standing there, hands at his sides, looking at the door. Then, without raising his voice, he said, "Heather?" "Daniel?" I didn't move. He waited maybe 10 seconds, then knocked again. And this is the part that really got to me. He didn't sound confused. He sounded like he knew people were inside. Like he was being polite by pretending he wasn't sure. I backed away and grabbed my phone. I texted Heather, "Someone is at the door." No response. I texted Daniel too. Same thing. The man stayed on the porch another 20 or 30 seconds, then finally stepped off and disappeared from the window. I rushed to the living room and checked through the front curtain, expecting to see him walking to a car. But there was no car, no headlights, no sound of an engine starting. It was like he had just walked into the dark. At that point, I started seriously thinking about leaving. Not because anything had happened exactly, but because the whole job suddenly felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. The problem was Owen. I couldn't just grab my bag and walk out with a kid asleep upstairs. And I definitely couldn't leave him alone. A few seconds later, I heard movement above me again. This time, faster. Small footsteps. Owen came halfway down the stairs and looked at me through the banister. He came early, he said. The way he said it made my skin crawl. Who came early? He didn't answer right away. He just looked toward the front door, then at me. Finally, he said, "Usually he waits until later." I went to the bottom of the stairs and told him to go back to his room. I tried to sound calm, like I didn't want to scare him, but I could hear the strain in my own voice. He didn't move. Then he said, "Did you look at him?" I said, "A little." His expression changed. It wasn't fear exactly. More like disappointment. Mom said not to do that for too long. That was enough for me. I called Heather. Straight to voicemail. Called Daniel. Same thing. Then I sent another text. "Please answer. The man is here." Still nothing. I brought Owen downstairs because suddenly I did not want him up there alone. I told him we'd just hang out in the living room until his parents got back. He didn't argue. He curled up in the corner of the couch with his knees pulled up, holding a blanket, and kept glancing toward the front hallway. To distract him, I asked if he wanted a snack. He said no. I asked if he wanted to watch a movie. He said no. Then, after a pause, he asked me, "If he asks you to let him in, you won't, right?" I said, "No, of course not." And then I made the mistake of asking, "Who is he?" Owen looked down at the blanket and rubbed the edge of it between his fingers. "Dad says he used to live here." I waited, and he thinks we're still supposed to let him in. That answer was so bizarre, I almost thought I'd misheard him. "What do you mean he used to live here?" But Owen had already shut down. You know how kids do that, when they realize they've said more than they were supposed to? He just shrugged and stared at the TV without really watching it. 9:30 came and went. Then 10. No texts. No calls back. The house felt colder by then. Or maybe I was just more aware of it. Every creak made me jump. I kept checking the driveway, then the back door, then the kitchen windows. I even found myself wondering if maybe the parents were testing me somehow. Like this was some insane way of seeing whether I'd follow instructions. But that theory died the second I heard something at the back of the house. A tap, then another. Not on the door this time. On the window, over the kitchen sink. I grabbed Owen's shoulder before he could turn around. I don't know why. I just didn't want him seeing it if someone was back there. We both sat completely still while the tapping came again. Light. Almost playful. My whole body went cold. Because now it wasn't some guy who didn't realize no one wanted him there. Now it was someone circling the house. I whispered to Owen, "Stay here." Then I pulled out my phone and called 911. The dispatcher answered, and I immediately felt stupid because I didn't know what to say without sounding ridiculous. So I told the truth. I said I was babysitting. There was an unknown man outside the house. He'd knocked at the front door. Now someone was tapping on the kitchen window, and the parents weren't answering. The dispatcher asked if the man had tried to enter. I said not yet. She asked if I could see him. I said no. She told me officers would come check the area and asked me to stay on the line. While I was talking to her, the tapping stopped. Everything went quiet again. Then Owen said, very softly, "He does this." I covered the phone and said, "What?" "He walks around first, to see who looks." There are some sentences that just hit you in a way that logic can't keep up with. That was one of them. Because suddenly, it didn't sound like a random incident. It sounded practiced. Familiar. Repeated. The dispatcher heard my voice change and asked what was going on. I told her the child said this had happened before. She got more serious and told me officers were about 5 minutes out. 5 minutes has never sounded longer in my life. Then came the voice. It was from the back hallway, just beyond the kitchen, close enough that it sounded like the person was standing right outside the glass of the back door. "Daniel?" The man called. His voice was calm, gentle, almost like he was speaking to someone he knew well. "Daniel, I know you're in there." Owen grabbed the blanket so tight his knuckles went white. I could barely breathe. The dispatcher was asking, "Ma'am? Ma'am, what do you hear?" And I whispered, "He's at the back door." Then the man said, "You shouldn't leave the boy with strangers." That sentence went through me like ice water. Because it meant he knew Owen was inside. Maybe he'd seen us through a window. Maybe he already knew their routines. Either way, it turned the whole thing from creepy to dangerous. I took Owen and moved us into the downstairs powder room because it was the only room without windows. I locked the door, put him behind me, and stayed on the line with 911. From there, I could still hear faint movement in the house, or maybe outside the house. I couldn't tell. A soft thud once, a scrape, then silence again. I whispered to Owen, "Has he ever come inside?" He shook his head immediately. "No, Dad changed the locks." That answer made no sense until years later, but in that moment it only made me more afraid. Changed the locks from what? From who? Then, from somewhere near the front of the house, the doorknob rattled. Just once. A hard metallic twist. I think Owen started crying then, but very quietly, like he was trying not to make noise. I told the dispatcher he was trying the door. She told me the officers were pulling onto the street, and almost instantly, everything stopped. No more voice. No more footsteps. No more rattling. A minute later, there were heavy knocks at the front door and a loud voice announcing police. Real knocks this time. Urgent. Official. I didn't move until the dispatcher confirmed they were the responding officers. Then I came out with Owen and let them in. 2 officers cleared the house while a third stayed with us in the living room. They checked the backyard, the side yard, the street, even the detached garage. Nobody. The only thing they found was a set of wet shoe prints on the back patio under the kitchen window. Big prints. Men's boots? Maybe. The officer who stayed with us kept asking Owen simple questions, trying not to alarm him. Did he know the man's name? Had he seen him before? Did he know what he wanted? Owen wouldn't answer any of it. He just kept looking toward the hallway and asking when his parents would be back. The police finally reached Heather around 10:40. She came through the front door 15 minutes later looking pale and furious, and Daniel came in right behind her. The second Owen saw them, he ran straight into Heather and started crying for real. Not loud, but deep. Relief crying. Daniel looked at one of the officers, then at me, and I swear I saw something in his face that was almost like guilt. The police pulled them aside in the dining room for a few minutes. I couldn't hear much, just fragments. Again? One of the officers said. Then quieter voices. Then Heather crying. When they came back, nobody looked at me directly for a second. Eventually, Heather thanked me and handed me the cash in an envelope. It was more than we'd agreed on. She said she was sorry, that I should never have been put in that situation. Daniel said he would explain. His explanation was somehow both exactly what I feared and stranger than anything I'd imagined. Years earlier, before they bought the house, it had belonged to Daniel's older brother, Marcus. Marcus had lived there alone after a divorce and, according to Daniel, he'd become unstable. Not violent in the dramatic movie sense, but fixated. Erratic. He stopped paying bills, lost the property, and blamed Daniel for not helping enough. When Daniel and Heather later bought the house after it had gone through the bank, Marcus took it as some kind of betrayal, like his brother had stolen his life. At first, according to Daniel, Marcus just drove by sometimes. Then he started showing up at the door insisting he still belonged there. He would ask to come home. Then he would accuse them of hiding things from him. Once, when Owen was younger, Marcus had seen him through a window and started calling him by name. After that, they got a restraining order. For a while, it worked. Then Marcus started appearing again from time to time, usually late at night, usually only long enough to knock and leave. I asked the obvious question. Why didn't you tell me that before you left? Heather started crying harder. Daniel answered. He said they honestly thought Marcus had been gone for months. He said they didn't want to scare me or lose their child care at the last minute. He said they believed the alarm system was enough. That part confused me, because I hadn't seen any alarm panel, and then he admitted something that made me almost walk out right there. The system had been malfunctioning for a week. They were waiting for a technician. So, just to be clear, they left their child with a babysitter they'd never met in person, in a house where a family member with a restraining order had shown up before, while the security system wasn't working. I didn't yell, but only because I was too shaken to. One of the officers stepped in and said they'd discuss everything further another time. He also made it very clear that if Marcus returned again that night, he'd be arrested immediately. I left around 11:30. Daniel walked me to my car and apologized again. I didn't say much. I just got in, locked the doors, and drove home with all the interior lights on, because for some reason, I suddenly hated every dark window around me. You'd think that would be the end of it. Creepy babysitting story. Terrible parents. Never go back. And for a while, that's exactly what it was. Until 2 weeks later, I was getting out of my night class, walking across campus toward my car, when I saw a folded slip of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. I assumed it was a parking warning or a flyer. It wasn't. It was a plain piece of notebook paper with one sentence written in very neat block letters. You looked at me too. I stood there in the parking lot for a full 10 seconds without moving. My first thought was some awful prank. My second thought was that there was absolutely no way it was a prank. I got in my car and called the police from inside with the doors locked. By the time an officer came out, there was obviously no one around. The note didn't have fingerprints they could use. I told them about the babysitting job, the house, the man outside, everything. They took it seriously, but there wasn't much they could do. A detective called me the next day and confirmed what I already suspected. Marcus had apparently been seen in the area again. Not near my house, thank God, but near the neighborhood where Heather and Daniel lived. They believed he'd followed me that night after I left and recognized my car, then somehow found it again later. He had most likely been watching the house long enough to see me arrive, leave, and maybe even look at him through the glass. That was what Owen meant. He walks around first, to see who looks. Apparently Marcus had a pattern. He became fixated on people who acknowledged him directly. If they ignored the knocking and never showed themselves, he often left. If they watched him, talked to him, or reacted, he latched on. In his mind, that meant he'd been invited into the story. That sentence has stayed with me ever since. Invited into the story. I changed a lot after that. I stopped taking random babysitting jobs for one thing. I got paranoid about my car being followed. I checked mirrors constantly. If someone knocked on my parents' front door, unexpectedly, at night, I would literally leave the room. Even now, years later, I still hate answering doors after dark. I don't care who it is. The last update I ever heard came about 6 months later. Heather texted me, out of nowhere, just to say Marcus had finally been taken into psychiatric custody after he tried to force his way into another relative's home. She apologized again. Said Owen was doing better. Said they were moving. I never replied. Maybe that was petty. Maybe they were scared too. But every time I think back to that night, the thing that bothers me most isn't even Marcus. It's the fact that they knew enough to warn me not to answer the door, but not enough to tell me why. And the reason I still think about Owen, specifically, is because of one small moment that didn't hit me until much later. When the police were in the house that night and everything was technically over, I remember one officer kneeling in front of him and saying, "You did the right thing, buddy. You stayed inside." And Owen said, "I know. He only comes in if somebody lets him." At the time, that sounded like a child repeating some rule his parents had taught him. Now I'm not so sure. Because when I asked the detective later whether Marcus had ever actually gotten into the house before, there was a long pause on the phone. Then he said, very carefully, "Not officially." I asked what that meant. He told me there had been one earlier incident, before the restraining order, when Heather found the back door unlocked in the middle of the night and thought maybe Daniel had forgotten to secure it. Nothing was stolen. Nothing looked disturbed. But Owen, who was too young then to explain things clearly, apparently told his mother the next morning that the sad man had stood in his room and watched him sleep. They assumed it was a dream. Or at least they told themselves it was. So when I remember that night, I don't picture the porch first. I don't picture the kitchen window or the note on my car. I picture that little boy on the stairs, looking at me like I was the one who didn't understand the rules yet. Like I was new to something he'd already lived with for too long. And that's why, out of every creepy thing that has happened to me, that babysitting job still gets under my skin the most. Because the danger didn't start when the knocking started. It had been there long before I arrived. Sitting in the walls of that house, in the routines of that family, in the way an 8-year-old already knew exactly what not to do when the man came back. And for 5 hours, they left me alone with it,